So, we are in the thick of the psychedelic age. Until now, we've seen youth culture developing within itself, focusing on finding new highs, not really paying attention to the world around it. But in the beginning of 1967, came a song that caused the kids to stop and look around, and ask what can be changed.
I think it's time we stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
The name of the record, for what it's worth, shows that the creators didn't think that it could change much, and didn't believe it will make the youth take a political stance. But the wind began to change direction that year, and youth culture started to pose its truth in opposition to the truisms of the dominant culture, and demand change. Before we describe the new values that were mined out of the spirit of psychedelia, we shall do a quick summary of the old dogmas they went against.
Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
After World War II, the US and the UK, the two great winners, turned inside to deal with their inner problems. Having defeated the Nazi evil, the two nations believed that the same heroic spirit that drove them during the war will be able to defeat all the evils that dwell within them, and fix all the old wrongs. A spirit of unity lay upon these two societies, and the key word was consensus. The old political divisions were settled, and almost everyone got behind the overall policy. In economy, for instance, the American right agreed that the socialist reforms enacted by President Roosevelt brought prosperity, and accepted the welfare policy that combined free market with socialism. The left also agreed that the revolutionary Marxist way has failed, creating only communist dictatorships that brought mostly suffering to their citizens, and supported the welfare policy that was aimed at bringing a gradual improvement for the lower classes. In Britain, the end of the war saw the rise of a Labour government that enacted an uncompromising socialist policy. But when it turned out that this policy fails to get the country out of the age of austerity, it lost its favour with the people, and capitalist elements started to creep back in. Part of this welfare state approach was also the belief that everyone should have leisure time, resulting in a consumer society that demanded more and more leisure products, which made daily life more comfortable and diverse, and also fueled the wheels of the industry. By the mid-1950s, both countries started to enjoy economic prosperity, the social gaps were narrowing, and they seemed to be marching towards a future where there would be freedom, equality and affluence for all. A similar consensus was reached around the perception of human nature. Traditionally, the prevailing Puritan consciousness regarded human nature as sinful, and believed that only strict repression of instincts and strong discipline can create a functioning human society. The liberals, on the other hand, believed that the nature of man is good, and it is only the crooked structure of society that makes him go bad. However, the atrocious things that humans did to each other during the war compelled the liberals to rethink their position, and the leading liberal approach now was that man can be good, but for that he still needs to mature, and rid himself of the remains of the jungle animal that he once was. Therefore, we must keep on studying man, and look for ways to improve. The social sciences were now held in high repute, and the theories put forth by psychologists, sociologists and anthropologists were implemented by the system, trying to shape man in a better way. The conservative Puritans, meanwhile, did not believe that you can shape man to be good, but they did join the game and use the pervasive system to impose their strict codes, especially on sexuality. A similar atmosphere prevailed in Britain, where Victorian values still held sway. This power given to the government, and the tight social control it enacted, were opposed to the American spirit, traditionally based on individualism, pioneering and suspicion towards authority. To overcome this resistance, patriotism was trumpeted, and everyone was called upon to pull together to create a strong society, which will overcome both homegrown problems and the external communist threat. Individualism was still regarded as a good thing, but only within an acceptable frame, and everyone was supposed to conform and become useful citizens. Anyone who didn't conform was seen as suffering from a mental problem and was sent to psychiatric institutes, which we've already mentioned in previous chapters. But while individual exceptionality was still seen as basically a good thing, tribal exceptionality was completely unacceptable, seen as negating the social ideal. The aim was to eradicate all tribal differences and create a universal society, and anyone who wasn't on board was hounded and excluded. This atmosphere led to everyone adopting a unified look, with the men sporting short military haircuts and wearing suits like useful citizens, and the women following the prevailing fashion, which was always very feminine but not too sexy. In the process, a new balance was established between men and women. The perception was that the man is selfish and driven by his instincts, mainly his sex drive, whereas the woman is a social creature and practically devoid of sexuality. Therefore, to establish the universal society, the woman is the one who should be in charge, through the rearing of the coming generations. During the war years, many women went out to work and started to think in terms of career, but now the prevailing mindset encouraged them to go back home and take a role that was portrayed as more important, the role of a housewife that is in charge of the children's upbringing. The housewife now got a lot of attention, and was given instructions on how to best do her job, while the industry created products aimed to make her life easier. The youth, too, was given a lot of attention, and the system made a lot of effort to create all the terms needed for it to go upright and become the generation that will take us forward towards the perfect society. This was the first generation of youth that had its own money to spend, and the industry created the term teenager to define this new market, with products aimed directly at it. But for teenagers, all of this was quite confusing and contained some sharp contradictions. On the one hand, they had money to go out and have a good time, but on the other hand, they were under stern puritanical supervision. On the one hand, they were taught to work for a better future, but on the other hand, they were born into a nuclear age and the Cold War, which created the feeling that the world has no future. On the one hand, they were taught to overcome racism and regard all people as equal, but on the other hand, the idea of getting out of the jungle has caused blacks, that were perceived as representing jungle culture, to be portrayed as inferior people. Since it didn't live through the bloody struggles of the previous decades, the youth didn't appreciate the merits of compromise and conformity, and perceived the previous generations as fake and hypocritical. When rock and roll arrived in the mid-50s, it answered all these problems, providing elation and sexual ecstasy in the here and now, and unifying all youth, black and white, boys and girls, rich and poor, in one movement. Thus, the youth detached from the role ordained for it, the role of creating the perfect society, and instead developed its own culture through rock and roll. From here on, it was the teenagers that dictated to the industry what products it should create for them. Rock and roll records, electric guitars, surfboards, motorbikes, hair gel, cool outfits, etc. In the previous chapters, I described the formation of this generational gap, which generated a youth culture with different intuitions from those of the previous generations. I pointed out the intuitive evolution that I consider to be the most crucial. The fact that previous generations still thought in terms of eliminating suffering as the highest goal, whereas the new generation, for which suffering was not a major part of life, was no longer willing to settle on that, but was more focused on the pursuit of happiness. The youth didn't want non-suffering, it wanted elation. I've discussed the other revolutions that resulted from that. The preference of performance over writing, the emphasis on immediate experiences over future goals, the gathering in tribal subcultures over the attempt to create a universal society. We've also seen that the previous generations didn't realize what was happening, and thought that they were dealing with moral and social degeneracy. But I am looking at it from the vantage point of a half a century later, a distance that helps me understand the root of the conflict, interpret the new intuitions and see the logic behind them. The youth back then didn't have the ability to do so, and so they couldn't respond to their parents berating them for their bad musical taste and moral degeneracy. All they knew was that rock and roll speaks to something inside of them, and feels a lot more real than the values society was trying to instill in them. The great rock and roll songwriters, like Chuck Berry, Carl Perkins and Eddie Cochran, wrote songs that express the feeling that this is rock and roll and it's ours. The grown-ups can't understand it and we don't know how to explain it ourselves, but we know it makes us feel better than anything else the world has to offer. There was no one to decipher these intuitions, to articulate them in a way that would be understood by others, and the rock and roll kids just kept on living by them without trying to create a worldview to ground them in. And then came Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan gave the youth the vindication it was looking for. In his contact with the adult world, that world that always dismissed youth culture, he retaliated by exposing their cluelessness. He was preceded in that by the Beatles, especially the sarcastic John Lennon, who in their media interviews were always pranking the interviewers and showing how out of touch they were. But Dylan gave the impression that the grown-ups are not just out of touch when it came to dealing with the pop world, but that they are altogether belonging to a generation whose time has passed. In his records, he found ways to merge rock and roll with poetry and theater and with the legacy of Western spirit, and made the youth feel like his lyrics harbor secrets that can lead us to the truth. This idolization of Dylan went too far, but it is hard to overstate his importance as an artist. He was the one who endowed the other rock and roll artists with the feeling that they had something to say, and encouraged them to try and understand the intuitions at the basis of their culture. Under his influence, many rock and rollers began writing songs that tried to express in words what the music was telling them, and started a conversation through which youth culture would develop a new worldview. In the record Ballad of a Thin Man, Dylan mocks those scholars who think that they have a top-down view on youth culture, and that they are capable of understanding it. Mr. Jones is an archetype of such a scholar, who comes armed with his outdated academic theories and tries to implement them to understand the 60s youth, but actually has no idea what he is talking about.
You know something is happening here, but you don't know what is. Do you, Mr. Jones?
Dylan, as we recall, started out as part of the folk movement, which was another musical movement that rebelled against the 50s consensus. But folk kept on playing the old game of capitalism versus Marxism, and its gripe with the status quo was that the progress is too slow. Dylan got out of this old equation and connected to the fresh intuitions of the rock and roll youth, but also maintained the broader look of folk, its social criticism. And the rock and roll bands that were influenced by him started also, in the second half of the 60s, to look around. Psychedelia gave the youth the belief that it really had something new and important to say. Through it, it began exploring the mind, and realized that it is dominated by certain beliefs which make their holder experience the world in a certain way, whereas the changing of perception makes him experience the world differently. This was the origin of the 60s saying, "It's all in the mind."
It's all in the mind, you know.
While the Marxist folkies believed that only a change in the social structure would bring a better world, the hippies believed that the road to happiness is to be achieved through changing one's consciousness, liberating it from old beliefs, and pointing it towards a joyful existence. The first Beatles record that can be defined as psychedelic is Rain, which came out in May 1966. In the record, Lennon is mocking the people who run and hide when rain begins to fall, only to emerge when the sun comes out. Rain and shine, he says, are just a state of mind. What Lennon says is that our tendency to hide from the rain is something that has been instilled in us, and has no basis. A man with a liberated mind can enjoy existence whether it rains or shines. McCartney had something else to say about Rain. In Fixing a Hole, a track on the Sgt. Pepper album, he tells us that he built a place of his own and filled all the cracks that let the rain in, and distracted his mind from wandering freely. But here too we find dismay at other people, those who keep running around and play the roles the society ordained for them, instead of joining him in the life of reflection and mind liberation. Then again, he doesn't claim superiority over them. He is happy in his world, but can't say for sure if he is wrong or right, if he is truly living the best type of existence. All he knows is that where I belong I'm right. In his private world, he is doing what's best for him, and feels happy. And that's good enough for him. But a few months later, in the Magical Mystery Tour project, we already find a different insight, a different approach. In The Fool on the Hill, McCartney once again tells us about a recluse who lives in his own world, secluded from society. Everyone laughs at him and thinks he is a fool, but the fool on the hill sees the sun going down, and the eyes in his head see the world spinning round. The fool is compared to Galileo, who like everyone else saw the sun setting, but with the eyes in his head, i.e. with his mind, understood that it is actually the world that is spinning. This is no longer the subjective stance that we saw in Fixing a Hole. Here, he believes that his truth is objective, and true for everyone. Okay, this is after all just a song, and there's no basis to think that the Beatles believe that they are holding the absolute truth. But this path I described here, where someone's private joyful experience eventually gets him to believe that he found the truth that will bring joy to everyone, is something that happened many times throughout history. And among the hippies as well, there were many who believed that they found the key to happiness, and must now bring the gospel to the rest of humankind. What causes people to make this transition? The answer is that this is a prejudice that is embedded deep in Western culture, and Eastern culture for that matter. There is a deep-seated belief that in order to be happy, man must find the truth at the basis of existence, and this truth is eternal and universal, true to every human in any time and place. Because of this traditional view, truth and happiness are connected to each other in our consciousness, and as a result, when a person encounters something that makes them feel extreme happiness, they are driven to believe that they have found the eternal truth. We met this line of thinking before. For instance, we saw how Timothy Leary argues that our mind is captivated by all sorts of games that are imposed on it, and the psychedelic experience frees it from all these games, and makes it dwell in the realm of truth. How does Leary know that what he experienced is indeed the truth? Does he have any proof of that? Actually, he has only one piece of evidence, and that is the fact that he felt intense joy during the psychedelic experience. But that one piece of evidence was enough for him. Leary, who presumed to have freed himself of all games, was actually still caught in one of the oldest games of all, the game that determines that to be happy you must hold the truth, and that is what made him interpret the joy of the psychedelic experience as stemming from finding the truth. In the same way, we saw how Ken Kesey builds an entire picture of the universe based on the psychedelic experience, out of the belief that this experience opened up a window for him to see the truth. Actually, this belief has no grounds. No one ensures us the truth will bring happiness, or that happiness indicates that we found the truth. But these people have a problem. These joyful experiences that they have are only temporary, and eventually they fall back to the ground. How can they explain it, if truth is supposed to be eternal? The regular answer is that what they've experienced isn't the whole truth, but only part of it. In other words, the experience gives us a taste of heaven, but our existence remains mostly in our fallen world. And so, those who went through the experience believe that they have to dive deeper into it, find what's behind it, and once they do, they will be able to make it permanent and remain in paradise forever. In Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, John Lennon describes a psychedelic experience during which he finds himself in a wondrous world, where he chases a divine and sparkling girl named Lucy, believing that if he catches her his world will be complete. The psychedelic experience itself is no longer enough. Now we also want to find what's behind it.
Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds.
Again, this belief doesn't have a leg to stand on. No one has ever managed to show that there is something beyond those temporary joyful experiences, or that there is a way to make them permanent. But this prejudice is implanted so deep in our consciousness that it directs our actions. And so, the youth began looking for the truth behind the psychedelic experience, with the hope of making it permanent. Many believed that Eastern thought was already enlightened to this experience, and could contain the answers that they were looking for. The Beatles, for instance, traveled to India at the end of 1967, and spent a few weeks with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who popularized the transcendental meditation technique, said to give you the psychedelic experience without drugs. Others looked for it in other mystical creeds. Youth culture, as we recall, started out rebelling against the idea that we need to work towards a perfect future, and believed that we should live for today, create ecstatic experiences in the here and now. But at the end of '67, it started to fall back into the old game, into the belief that we must aspire to find the eternal truth and create a world based on it. Then again, truth for them was no longer based on gradual progress out of the jungle towards an enlightened society. They looked for more immediate ways to achieve salvation. The way, as mentioned, was through changing your consciousness. The social consensus that prevailed in the 50s was based on compromise, on people conforming to the will of the collective. The hippies claimed that there was no need to compromise. Once we liberate our mind, we realize that there is natural harmony between us, and then we can both live according to our nature and dwell in a harmonic society. Rock festivals, from Monterey onwards, were purported as microcosms of such a society. This culminated in the Woodstock Festival, in the summer of '69, when hundreds of thousands of youngsters spent 3 days together, in a world based on music and love and not on tribalism and hostility. The festival inspired Johnny Mitchell to write this song.
We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon. We are golden, caught in the devil's bargain, and we got to get ourselves back to the garden.
We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon, she sings, adopting a materialistic view. But then she continues, we are golden, caught in the devil's bargain, switching to Christian rhetoric. And we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. What garden? Why, the Garden of Eden, of course. This mixing of secular and religious imagery, typical of the hippies, shows what they were after. They wanted to go back to paradise, and they believed that paradise is not in the afterlife, but can be achieved in this world. Peace and love became the slogan. From the summer of love onwards, the youth felt itself as expressing true fraternity, in opposition to the adults who are busy having wars with each other. The Cold War between capitalism and communism seemed silly to this youth, that rejected the ideology at the basis of both of them. This Cold War had a very hot manifestation at the time. The US was busy fighting the communists in Vietnam, and conscription was imposed to fill in the ranks, compelling all young Americans to go fight this war. Until '68, only folk artists raised their voice against the war, and rock and roll ignored the issue. But that all changed when the hippies started to preach the peace and love gospel. Here's Country Joe, the folk singer turned hippie, singing a satirical song that mocks his fellow Americans who go to die without asking why. But unlike the protest movement which the folkies and other lefties were part of, the hippies had another idea of how to bring peace. They didn't believe in politics, they believed in changing consciousness. The hippies believed that through music, and through spreading their lifestyle, they can change the world, and that protests are part of the old game, based on negativity and hate. The man who manifested this view most of all was John Lennon. Lennon, in 1968, began his relationship with Yoko Ono, which will eventually lead to their marriage. Ono was a Japanese artist who belonged to the Fluxus movement, an avant-garde movement that believed, among other things, that art should be taken out of the museums and onto the streets, so it can become part of everyday life and change the culture. But the artists who belonged to this movement soon found out, to their chagrin, that the problem with the traditional artistic mediums isn't just that they are trapped in museums and concert halls. The problem is that they lost touch with the public, because they speak a language that the masses no longer understand. This is the same feeling that Ken Kesey had about literature, which made him abandon it and turn to rock music and movie making instead. These artists, despite their efforts, didn't leave much of an impression, and failed to reach the general public. Except, of course, Yoko Ono, who was accompanied by a man who was constantly under the public eye. Influenced by Yoko, Lennon began thinking in terms of turning his life into an ongoing artistic performance, utilizing the fact that the cameras were always on him to create meaningful artistic events. Everything that the couple did was aestheticized, and their message to the world was that if a British pop star and a Japanese avant-garde artist can fall in love, there's no reason that the world won't be able to overcome its divisions. When they got married, they decided to turn their honeymoon into an event which they called Bed-In, in which they spent 2 weeks in bed in different hotel suites and invited people to come have a dialogue. During the Bed-In, Lennon also wrote a song and invited some friends to join him in the bedroom and sing it. Lennon starts out mocking all the isms of the time, and tells us to forget about all these ideologies, and just give peace a chance. Then he proceeds to call out the names of many of the heroes of the time, including some we've mentioned. We can even see some of them, like Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg, joining John and Yoko in the chorus. As we've seen, the psychedelic experience caused many of those who experienced it to feel unity, not just with the people around them but also with the entire cosmos. Therefore, the hippies preached not just peace and love between humans, but also between man and nature. Going against the industrial power that America was so proud of in the 1950s, the hippies decried what this power does to nature. Earlier we've seen Joni Mitchell singing that we are on our way to an earthly paradise. But in another song, she tells us how they paved over paradise to build a parking lot.
Now they took all the trees, put them in a tree museum. And they charged all the people $1.50 just to see 'em. I said, don't it always seem to go? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
There was actually nothing new about this claim. The traditional Western attitude towards nature is based on the Judeo-Christian belief that man was put on the earth to rule it. This approach led to science, which explores nature to understand and master it. And out of that came technology, which gives us ever greater control on the world around us, and industry, which processes nature for our needs. But there were always movements in the West that went against this trend, and preached that man is part of nature, and should live harmoniously with it. The Industrial Revolution created even greater alienation between man and nature, and the Romantic movement of the 19th century contained many voices that wanted to reconnect to nature. Some of these voices now resonated with the hippies, and with them, this movement of return to nature became part of popular culture, a lot more widespread. The result was the birth of the environmental movement which persists today.
In South Carolina.
In music, this was manifested in some rock bands turning to country. Country is the music of the rural folks, those who regard the simple rustic life of the village as a true existence, away from the urban life that twists and complicates the human soul. Some hippies found in this music a medium to express escape from the urban world and return to the land. We've already mentioned the Byrds, pioneers of folk rock and psychedelia. And they were pioneers in this as well, as in 1968 they released an album that laid the foundations to a new style, country rock.
That I'm getting the feel of hickory red.
Earlier on, in the psychedelic phase, the Byrds already released a single that, in a way, indicates its direction. In Fifth Dimension, from mid-1966, we find all the usual psychedelic elements: the sensation of passive floating, the feeling that you are merging with the universe, the sense that you are gaining a top-down view on your existence and understanding its essence. But what insight does the protagonist of this trip arrive at? The dissent here is not just against industry and technology, but against the very thing that they are based on, Western science. Science, the Byrds sing, is madness that only causes misery. We need to liberate ourselves from it to be happy. We've already encountered this criticism of science in Aldous Huxley, who argued that looking at nature through scientific glasses has a reducing effect on our perception, making us ignore everything that cannot be scientifically measured. Huxley's alternative was to combine the scientific approach with an aesthetic approach, giving us a more comprehensive and well-rounded view of existence. Psychedelia, at first, lived up to Huxley's ideal. It blended scientific exploration and use of the wonders of technology with going out to nature and developing the mystical side of the soul. But here, we already see a complete defection to the other side, and there were hippies who believed that they should turn their back on science, technology and the modern world, and find the truth in nature and in mystical approaches that provided a different truth, one that can't be grasped by scientific thought. Then again, not everyone developed this hate to science and technology. There were some who took this rebellious spirit in the direction of undermining the industry's monopoly on technology, and finding ways to take technology in different directions. Computer science, for instance, was developing in strides since World War II, and was completely in the hands of giant corporations like IBM, that took it in industrial and military directions. In the 60s, some youngsters began exploring this field, aiming to bring the creative hippie spirit into it. Out of the explorations we got video games, the home computer, and practically the entire cybernetic world as we know it today. This change in attitude towards nature was most prominent when it came to the issue of sex. Christianity teaches that sex is impure, that even sexual thoughts are sinful, and that the human body is a prison we need to be released from. Sex, in the dominant Christian thought, is something that should be done not for recreation, but only for procreation. In the 50s, with the tight social control blended with Puritanism, the repression of sexuality was at its peak, but the second half of the decade saw the invention of two things that tore it to shreds: the birth control pill, which allowed you to have sex without fear of pregnancy, and rock and roll, with the rhythm and wild dance moves brought from blacks, which was like an orgasmic release from the repression. With the hippies, the sexuality of rock and roll became ideological, an ideology that turned Christian metaphysics on its head, and claimed that the body is beautiful, that sexuality is an expression of love between humans, and that the sexual act should be done first and foremost for enjoyment. Beyond enjoyment, the act was also believed to be freeing our consciousness from its fear of sexuality, just like the drugs freed it from other inhibitions. Make love, not war, was the slogan. If more people made love, believed the hippies, there would be less wars and strife in the world. Thus, we got the holy trinity of the hippie culture: sex, drugs, rock and roll. Driven by this ideology, rock and roll became more and more sexually daring, more and more explicit. 50s rock and roll still used euphemisms and innuendo, but the way Jimi Hendrix played the guitar left very little room for the imagination. And with heavy metal, which took acid rock to more physical directions, the sexuality became even more graphic. An essential change also occurred in female attitude towards sex. In the 50s, girls were taught that they have no sexual drive, and that the aspiration should be to get a man to marry them and build a family. Rock and roll, at first, was a guy thing, horny boys looking to seduce girls. The early youth subcultures, the teddy boys, the rockers and the surfers, were also a guy thing. But in the early 60s came the girl bands, that represented the female side of youth culture, and the mods were the first youth subculture where girls were an integral part, and could express their creativity and individuality and contribute to the culture. In girl band songs, they would always be turned on by bad boys. Those who were rebellious rode bikes and danced to rock and roll songs. And still, those early 60s records were part of the old consciousness, expressing a desire to tame these wild boys and make good husbands out of them. When the hippies came along, they brought a new female attitude, of women who wanted to enjoy sex as well. Grace Slick and Janis Joplin were the first white female singers who moved on stage in the uninhibited way that men did. But they still had a lot to learn from black performers. Here's Tina Turner, one of the only black rock artists of the 60s.
And baby, you got what I need.
And I want you to give it to me.
And I want you to give it to me.
Make me sing.
If you just stay with me and make me.
The attitude towards parenting also went a radical transformation. The kids who grew into the 50s paradigm, which tried to shape the next generation, threw away these reins, and some went to the opposite extreme, and believed that they should let their kids grow as their nature dictates, with no restraints.
Can I go ride my Zoom? It goes 200 miles an hour, suspended on balloons. And can I put a droplet of this new stuff on my tongue? And imagine frothing dragons while you sit and wreck your lungs. And I must be permissive, understanding of the younger generation.
These ideals of love towards your fellow man and towards nature manifested themselves in the hippie communes that started to spring in California. These communes grew organically, driven by the shared spirit that imbued them, not out of some Marxist ideology. In the early days of the Haight-Ashbury scene, the members of the Grateful Dead all lived together in the same apartment, sharing everything, and so did others. From there, the next step was to go out of city limits and return to nature, and there were hippies who purchased farms and built communes, growing their own food and dreaming of feeding the entire world.
Bought myself a farm way out in the country, spent time in the hayloft with the mice and the bunnies, spent time in the country.
We are hearing Jefferson Airplane singing a country rock hymn to the farm communes. In 1969, Jefferson Airplane was swept by the new revolutionary spirit, and became one of its main voices. We should, however, distinguish between this revolutionary spirit and revolutionary Marxism, which we shall discuss in the next episode. The Marxists believe that if we topple the existing order, a better one will naturally emerge, so they focused on a violent struggle against the system. The hippies, in contrast, focused on creating and developing an alternative, believing that it will gradually conquer more and more minds and eventually usurp the old system without violence. In short, they believed in winning through culture, not through politics. Thus, the counterculture of the 60s was born, a counterculture borrowed from the spirit of psychedelia and the hippies. The values of this counterculture were developed mainly in and around rock music, which meant that new channels had to be created to spread these values. New record labels were formed, dedicated to finding and recording rock bands. Since many of these records would not be played by radio stations, pirate radio began to thrive, beaming this mind-blowing music into the bedrooms of kids. Important music critics started to emerge, and they discussed not only the music itself but also the insights and values contained in it, adding to the conversation. Magazines that were wholly dedicated to the culture began to be published, the most important of them being Rolling Stone, based in San Francisco. The magazine offered a new kind of journalism, which became known as gonzo journalism, in which the reporter would not try to be objective, but offer their point of view. Often, it meant that they had to become part of the event that they were reporting on, and give their first-person account. A bit later came the magazine National Lampoon, which took the spirit of the counterculture in the direction of subversive humor. In the early 70s, National Lampoon would also spread into stand-up comedy, and then to TV and movies, and this new humor would dominate American comedy for decades. All of these channels emerged spontaneously and organically, but from 1968 there began an effort to bring everything together, to create an alternative society. The dream was to turn the counterculture into a self-contained world, a society that creates its own food and shares it around, a culture that creates new ecstatic experiences through music and turns life into endless fun, a collective mind that forms new insights through the psychedelic trips and takes human consciousness to new realms, a civilization that exists in peace and love. And there were also attempts to enter the political sphere. In 1968, the Youth International Party, or YIP for short, was formed, and its members referred to themselves as Yippies. As implied by their name, the Yippies were the political version of the hippies, bringing the spirit of the merry pranksters into politics, aspiring to turn the political system into a circus of random pranks and gimmicks. The revolutionary ideology, they declared, draws its spirit from Marx. Not Karl Marx, the Marx Brothers. The hippies initiated a series of pranks that reached its peak in the 1968 presidential elections, during which they nominated and ran a pig named Pegasus for president. It was all supposed to be in good fun, but the authorities, from the other side of the generational gap, didn't get the joke. The hippies' militant declarations that they are going to create a society based on sex and drugs were taken seriously by the authorities, and their violent reaction wasn't fun at all. The attempts to step out of the counterculture bubble and into the world of the dominant culture led to bad results, as we shall see in the coming episodes. The last attempt by the counterculture to play the political game happened in 1969, when Timothy Leary ran to the governorship of California, then governed by Ronald Reagan, a sworn enemy of the hippies. He even solicited John Lennon to write a campaign song for him, but the campaign was terminated when Leary was arrested and charged for possession of drugs. The Beatles then reworked the song for themselves, and turned it into a song about a hippie person who calls on the world to join him and unite. By then, however, the spirit of unity in the counterculture had pretty much dissipated, and the atmosphere became increasingly more negative. From here on, it was all downhill.